In Chapter 6, we're going to take a look at the endocrine system. The endocrine system has two really important functions in the body. So the first one is that it's going to maintain homeostasis. And the second function is communication. It'll use the hormones to talk to different parts of the body, tells them what to do in order to maintain homeostasis. Remember, the other organ system in the body that also has these two functions is the nervous system. So remember, the endocrine system and nervous system, they're in charge of the body and they maintain homeostasis. If you remember from Chapter 1, the type of tissue that endocrine glands are made out of is epithelial tissue. And we have primary and secondary endocrine organs. We'll talk about both. The primary endocrine organs, that's their primary function, is to secrete hormones. Whereas the secondary endocrine organs, they have other main jobs and they kind of do the hormones as a side job. So here's a picture of the primary endocrine organs listed on the left. And then we've got some of the secondary endocrine organs that are listed over here on the right. You don't have to memorize which ones are primary and which ones are secondary. I will not ask you that. But we will go through these and talk about where they're located and which hormones they're secreting and what they're doing in the body. Here are the primary endocrine organs. So their main job is to secrete hormones. We'll go through all of these and talk about the hormones they secrete and what they're doing. You don't need to memorize that these are all primary endocrine organs. The first two endocrine glands we're going to talk about are the hypothalamus and pituitary. The hypothalamus is located in the brain, and which two organ systems is it part of? So hopefully you said that it's part of the nervous system because it is part of the brain. And then it obviously is going to be part of the endocrine system as well. So it also secretes hormones. And the hypothalamus is really important. It's kind of like the president of the endocrine system. It's going to control what hormones the pituitary secretes. And then the pituitary is kind of like the vice president of the endocrine system. And it will control a lot of what the other endocrine glands in the body will secrete. So the hypothalamus and the pituitary, they're pretty much in charge of a lot of the other endocrine glands in the body. The pituitary gland is located right below the hypothalamus. Another name that you might see for the pituitary gland, it's also called the hypophysis. Hypo meaning below, and then physis means growth, so it literally means the growth below the hypothalamus. And there's two lobes to the pituitary gland, so we'll look at a picture here in a moment, but it kind of looks like this. So the anterior lobe is the part that faces the front, so towards your face, and the posterior lobe faces the back of your head. The anterior lobe is actually made out of endocrine gland cells, so they're made out of epithelial cells. And another name for the anterior pituitary gland is called the adenohypophysis. So hypophysis, just talking about the pituitary gland, and then adeno, that actually refers to gland. Just saying that it's actually made out of epithelial tissue, actual endocrine gland cells. The posterior lobe in the back, another name for that is the neurohypophysis. And that's because it's actually made out of neurons that actually start in the hypothalamus and then they extend down and then make up the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And then the infundibulum, which is kind of a funny word, that's the stalk that the pituitary gland hangs down below the hypothalamus from. So that word infundibulum actually means funnel. So that's where that came from. And all of the hypothalamic and pituitary hormones are made out of proteins, except for one of the hypothalamic hormones. It's dopamine, or also called prolactin inhibiting hormone, or PIH. And that one is an amine hormone and has amine in the name there. So remember, they're derived from amino acids. And so all of the hypothalamic and pituitary hormones are going to be hydrophilic. So here's just a picture looking at the anatomy. So the thalamus is located right here, and then right below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. So that's where the name hypothalamus came from, because hypo just meaning below. And then we've got that infundibulum, or that little stalk, and then hanging off that you've got the pituitary gland. And then the anterior lobe will be facing the front toward your face, and then the posterior lobe will be facing towards the back of your head. So this is really important to know. Between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary, there's a neural connection. So starting up here in the hypothalamus, we've got these neuron cell bodies, and they will extend down, and they will actually make up the posterior pituitary. And so these hypothalamic neurons extend down, make the posterior pituitary, and then they secrete the hormones from the posterior pituitary. And then with the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus, there's a very different connection. There's a blood connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So these neurons that are in the hypothalamus, they do not extend down and make up the anterior pituitary. They just stop here on the hypothalamus. They will secrete their hypothalamic hormones into the blood here. And then the hypothalamic hormones will get taken to the endocrine cells here in the anterior pituitary and then tell the anterior pituitary what hormones to release into the blood from there. So very important to remember that there is a neural connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. And then there's a blood connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So I definitely would know that for the exam. That's really important to know. Okay, so let's take a look at the posterior pituitary hormones first, because there's only 2 of them, so that's really easy. So we have ADH and oxytocin. Both of these are what we call neurohormones, because we have neurons that are releasing hormones into the blood. So let's start with ADH first. That stands for antidiuretic hormone. So if you look at the word, a diuretic means to flow through, and a diuretic is something that makes you pee a lot. So if you have something that's an antidiuretic, that's going to make you not pee very much. Okay, so the function of ADH is that it's going to go to the kidneys, and it will tell your kidneys to save the water from the urine and put it back into the blood. And when you do that and putting that water back into the blood, you end up increasing the volume of the blood, and that actually increases your blood pressure. And also helps with, if you're dehydrated, you're no longer going to be dehydrated anymore either. Okay, and then the other name for antidiuretic hormone is called vasopressin. So if you look at the name vasopressin, so vaso is talking about the blood vessels, and then pressin is talking about you're pressing on them. So the other thing that ADH will do is it will go to the smooth muscle around the blood vessels, and it will cause them to vasoconstrict. And if your blood vessels vasoconstrict, they get smaller in diameter, and that will also increase your blood pressure. Okay, so ADH will help you save water and also increase your blood pressure. So a problem that we can see with ADH is diabetes insipidus. This has nothing to do with your blood glucose. Okay, the one that has to do with your blood glucose is diabetes mellitus, which we'll talk about later. So the word diabetes just means to flow through, and it's just talking about the fact that you end up drinking a lot and peeing a lot. And insipidus means without taste, because way back when they didn't have good tests, and so the doctors would taste your urine. And if you had diabetes insipidus, you were drinking a lot, peeing a lot, and the doctor tasted your urine, it wouldn't have a sweet taste to it. And so then they would know that, oh, you have diabetes insipidus. So what's happening here is that the person is either not producing ADH or the kidneys aren't responding to it. Okay, and there's a number of causes for this, but the end result is you're not able to save the water from your urine, and so it just all goes out in the urine, and so you got to drink a lot to keep up with all that water you're losing in the urine. Okay, so that's diabetes insipidus. Okay, oxytocin is the other hormone that is secreted by the posterior pituitary, and there's two functions for oxytocin. So if we kind of look at our pictures over there on the right, if the woman is pregnant, one function of oxytocin is it goes to the uterus at the time of delivery and causes uterine contractions, and that will help deliver the baby. So when the baby's head starts pushing down through the cervix, that stretches the cervix, and then that will send a nerve signal up to the posterior pituitary to tell it to secrete the oxytocin. And then the oxytocin gets released, goes to the smooth muscle of the uterus, tells it to contract. That'll squeeze on the baby and then help deliver the baby. The other function of oxytocin once the baby has been delivered, with our other picture over there, is it helps stimulate milk letdown. And this gets the milk flowing. So it doesn't do anything about milk production. There's another hormone for that. But it tells the smooth muscle in the mammary glands around the ducts there to contract, and that helps get the milk flowing. So like when the mom hears the baby crying or the baby starts suckling, oxytocin gets released and that gets the milk flowing, and they call that milk letdown. Okay, and then the other thing that oxytocin is involved in is that it is involved in bonding. So it will help you bond with the baby, and it also is released during sex and helps you bond with your partner as well. So that's another function for oxytocin. Okay, and both ADH and oxytocin, these are both protein hormones, so they're both hydrophilic. So this picture is just to remind you that these hormones, ADH and oxytocin, are actually made by neurons that start up here in the hypothalamus. So they're going to be made up in these neuron cell bodies, and then they'll just be transported down the axons of these neurons and then stored down here on the axon terminals. And then when the stimulus comes, they'll just release their hormones into the blood, and then they'll travel to wherever their target cells are. I'm not going to ask you like which particular neurons in the hypothalamus secrete these, ADH and oxytocin. I won't ask you, but just making sure that you know that the posterior pituitary is made from neurons that extend down from the hypothalamus, and there's a neural connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. And then also just knowing that we have two hormones secreted by the posterior pituitary, ADH and oxytocin, and knowing what they do. I've also got a hormone table that I've put on Canvas that you can fill out, and I've also got the answers there to check your work, and that's a good way to study. And we'll also be making a little flow chart of all these too as we go as well.